Welcome to your World War II lecture. Your objectives are to understand why the U.S. entered World War II, how the U.S. prepared for World War II, and the social effects of World War II. The time period we're talking about here is 1937 to 1945. The war was between the Allied powers and the Axis powers. The Allied powers included the Big Three, which were the U.S., Great Britain, and Soviet Union, and others, including France and China. The Axis powers included Germany, Italy, and Japan. The war was fought on two fronts, the European theater and the Pacific theater. So why did the U.S. enter World War II? In order to talk about why the U.S. entered World War II, we need to discuss the events that led up to World War II. At the end of World War I, through various treaties, the Allies had carved up Europe. Also at the end of World War I, there was the Versailles Treaty. And in the Versailles Treaty, Germany had to pay reparations and give up some of their property. In fact, they had to pay about $133 billion in reparations, which, as we discussed before, they were not able to pay. This is what the world looked like before World War I. Britain supervised Iraq and Transjordan. France supervised Syria. And then you had reconstituted nations. Those are the ones in the green here. And what reconstituted nations means is that they had provisional governments. Japan took German colonies in East Asia, and France will maintain Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam. During the 1920s, there was the rise of fascism. What fascism was is that it was focused on nationalism and generally one leader, and oftentimes it was a military leader. And fascists opposed communism, socialism, and capitalism. And socialism means common ownership of property and such. And communism means there is a classless system, which are obviously the opposite of capitalism. Fascism originated in Italy in the 1920s, and it was developed in response to the economic downturn or the economic depression that was going on in Europe in the 1920s. Fascism also developed in Germany, Spain, and Japan. The dictators were Mussolini in Italy, and then Germany, of course, it had Hitler. And these are the two gentlemen you see here. This gentleman was Tojo, who was also a fascist, and he was a leader in Japan. Italy wants to compete globally. He wants to compete economically. So Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, and Ethiopia was an independent African country. Mussolini, which is the gentleman you see here, the leader of Italy, was criticized by the League of Nations. If you remember, we talked about the League of Nations happening at the end of World War I. The U.S. did not join the League of Nations, but other countries did. So the idea of the League of Nations was if you were part of the League of Nations and you were invaded by another country, then those members of the League of Nations would go to your aid. And for the League of Nations, and then will be criticized for invading Ethiopia, but nothing is really done about it. And you have Hitler. Germany's in the middle of an economic depression, rising unemployment, and then fear of communism, which all will contribute to Hitler's rise in power and his Nazi party. And he will become dictator in 1933. If you'll remember, Germany was hit with all of these reparations at the end of World War I, which contributed to their economic downturn and, of course, rising unemployment. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, which is basically a work that outlines plans to overturn territorial settlements lost at Versailles as a result of the Versailles Treaty. His plan was going to unite Germans in Central Europe and take areas of Eastern Europe. He wanted to get rid of Jews, Gypsies, and Slavs. He wanted to create what was called the Master German Race, because Hitler blamed Jews for Germany's economic problems, and he will initiate an extermination campaign against them. That campaign is called the Holocaust. As I said earlier, Hitler was focused on creating a master race. He killed Polish people, Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, or anyone that was deemed to be undesirable. The U.S. knew about the killings, but the extent of the deaths were not revealed until after the war, especially at one of the death camps called Auschwitz. Here is a photograph of those who were interned at one of the death camps. And as you can see, they were starving. They were not fed well. They were often put in work camps. And then eventually, they were also often put in something called a crematorium, which is where they were gassed and burned. I have a clip from an interview of a Holocaust survivor. I'm not going to show it on this lecture, but I am going to put this link on Canvas, and I do want you to watch it because it's very important that you hear what she says. And she really talks about her experiences as a young girl and being put in concentration camps. So please be sure to listen. So leading back to the events that kick off the war. Germany invades Austria and part of Czechoslovakia, who were allied with Russia. Germany will issue an all-out blitzkrieg against Poland, which is a massive assault. Britain and France declared war against Germany in 1939. Germany invaded Denmark in 1940, and ultimately, Germany and Italy will form a political and military alliance. With respect to Japan, Japan also wants to compete globally and expand. Japan invaded China. They were criticized by the League of Nations for doing so, but again, the League of Nations did not intervene. This makes the U.S. very nervous. As a result, the U.S. issued an embargo against Japan, and the embargo was a restriction of oil to Japan because they wanted to debilitate them. Japan will occupy Indochina, which was a French colony, modern-day Vietnam. So, the U.S. will remain isolationist. At the time, a majority of Americans didn't want to enter into World War II because of the memories of World War I. Because World War I was so terrible and horrifying that the U.S. just didn't want to get involved in another world war. Congress will pass a series of acts to prevent the U.S. from going to war. Congress imposed what's called neutrality acts. One in particular was called the Neutrality Act of 1935, which imposed embargoes on selling arms to warring countries. They also banned loans to the warring nations. They created what was called a cash and carry requirement. What that meant was if a warring nation purchased goods from the U.S., it had to pay cash and use its own ship to transport the goods. Americans were warned not to travel abroad, particularly in the war areas, and if they did so, they would be traveling at their own risk. This will later change, and the U.S. will supply countries who were vital to the U.S. security, such as Britain and Russia. They will provide them arms and equipment. In 1941, the U.S. Navy and German U-boats exchanged fire. So everything is really heating up from the late 1930s into the early 1940s, especially by 1941. And then on December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Japan chose Pearl Harbor because it was a naval base on American soil. Japan was intending on sending a message to America, particularly about American expansionism. In other words, what Japan was saying to America was, why is it okay for America to expand, but not Japan? So the U.S. declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., and ultimately the U.S. declares war on the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. So how did the U.S. mobilize for war? First, Congress issued the War Powers Act in 1942 that gave authority to FDR to conduct the war. Also, the government issued the Revenue Act in 1942. And what the act did was to expand the tax base to include everyone. In other words, it was a way to help pay for the war. Just to give you an example, in 1939, 3.9 million people paid taxes. In 1945, 42.6 million people paid taxes. The government did other things as well, such as increased their manufacturing. For example, in 1939, the U.S. manufactured 6,000 airplanes in 1 year. During the war, 96,000 airplanes were being produced. Ultimately, World War II gets the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Another way they mobilized for war was through military enlistment. And the military enlistment included all walks of life, such as women, and 3 of those organizations were called the WACs, the WAVES, and the WASP, different branches of military. Their jobs were mostly clerical or nursing. We had the middle class enlisted into the war, the working class enlisted to the war, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, African Americans, although African Americans were segregated in the military still at that time. Many of the African Americans did menial duties. So everybody was involved in this war. Life on the home front. So what types of things did people do? How were people acting? What type of activities were they engaged in? Well, Americans rationed goods to benefit the war. They rationed cigarettes for U.S. soldiers. They rationed nylon and silk. Those were generally used for parachutes. And this rationing of nylon and silk actually created a new fashion trend for women. Women started to wear pants instead of pantyhose. And if any of you ladies have wore pantyhose, you'll know that that was a blessing. Americans rationed rubber, such as tires. It wasn't uncommon to see people take tires off their car, put the cars on the blocks, and use the rubber from the tires for the war. Americans rationed gasoline. Americans were asked to buy vacuum cleaners in support of the war effort. Americans grew victory gardens, recycled newspapers, scrap metal, and a number of other items. Show you a quick poster from the time period. This poster says, "Of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me." And finally, the war. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about the war, specifically military strategies or anything like that. I'm just going to highlight a few things. This is a map of the European theater. The Axis powers are in the blue. The Axis occupied areas are in the green. The Allied powers are in the pink, or at least those areas that the Allied powers occupied. And then the neutral nations are in the yellow. From 1942 to 1943, General Eisenhower and General Patton will lead the charge here. The Allies defeated German battles in places such as Africa. In June of 1944, the Allies invaded France, what is better known as D-Day. They will ultimately liberate Paris. The Allies will attack Germany by air. But what brings the European theater to an end is the Battle of Bulge in 1944 in Belgium. The Allied forces won there, and it's believed at this time is when Hitler committed suicide. As far as the Pacific Theater goes, Japan took the Philippines in 1942. The U.S. attacked a little island called Midway in 1942 as well. And the two major battles were at Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945. Prior to the end of the war, when it appeared that the Allies were going to win the war, there was a meeting called the Yalta Conference in 1945. It was a meeting of the Big Three: the U.S., Stalin, and Churchill. In this meeting, they agreed to divide Germany into 4 administrative zones, each controlled by the U.S., Great Britain, France, or Russia. They partitioned Berlin, and Russia agreed to have free elections in Central and Eastern Europe. They also replaced the League of Nations with the United Nations. The United Nations had a General Assembly and a Security Council, which was comprised of the United States, Great Britain, France, China, Russia, and other nations on a rotating basis. Before the war ends, Roosevelt dies and his vice president, Truman, took over. Truman was very different than FDR. He was not as experienced with foreign policy as FDR. He did not come from the same political upbringing or have the same political experience as FDR. But it was he who had to make the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The concern for the Allies here, particularly Truman, was that Japan would never surrender, that they fought to the death. They were known to have kamikaze pilots who fought to the death. He felt that he needed to drop these bombs on Japan in order to end the war. He felt that it would save lives, particularly American soldiers' lives, because otherwise Japan would never surrender. That's always been a subject of controversy, whether the U.S. should have done that or not, but nonetheless, that was the decision that was made. And after Truman drops the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, the war ends. All right, that's all for today. If you have any questions, let me know.